The human mind, in its most primitive form, is designed to endure. Pain, whether physical or emotional, is a signal, a warning that something is wrong. But the mind can only take so much. Over time, prolonged suffering can break down the very fabric of what we understand as reality. Philosophers have long pondered the nature of suffering. Friedrich Nietzsche, in his exploration of the will to power, suggested that suffering is an inherent part of human existence. But what happens when that suffering becomes unbearable? When there is no will left to endure? In his book Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Nietzsche poses the idea of eternal recurrence. What if your pain, your suffering, was not a fleeting moment, but an infinite loop, endlessly returning, the terror of reliving your worst experiences over and over, with no escape? Could your mind survive? Psychologically, the brain can only withstand so much trauma before it begins to break. Studies show that the brain, when subjected to extreme pain or stress, begins to rewire itself, releasing chemicals that can either numb the pain or distort reality. The longer the pain, the more likely the mind will fracture, losing its grip on what's real. But it's not just philosophy. This is real. The breaking of the mind is not a hypothetical. It happens to people in the real world every single day. Once again, the whole world, for me, is shifting, forgetting to be ill and replacing it with sin and sorrow and terror. Take Albert Woodfox, for example. For over 40 years, he was kept in solitary confinement in a Louisiana prison. No human contact, just the endless ticking of time, the silence, and his own thoughts. Woodfox became a victim of the horrors of isolation. His mind began to erode, his perception of reality fractured. He described his time as one where you lose your mind and then try to find it again. He wasn't alone. Research shows that solitary confinement causes extreme mental breakdowns. Hallucinations become common. Delusions of grandeur, fear, and paranoia creep in. Over time, the mind cannot distinguish between what is real and what is a product of its own pain. And then there's the case of Elizabeth Smart, who was kidnapped and held captive for 9 months. Her captors subjected her to not just physical abuse, but the kind of psychological torture that warps the human mind. Fear becomes a constant companion, and over time, Stockholm Syndrome sets in. The victim begins to sympathize with their captor. The mind, in an attempt to survive, distorts the sense of reality. Studies show that extreme, prolonged trauma can lead to dissociative identity disorder, the mind splintering into different parts to cope with the unbearable pain. The victim no longer recognizes themselves, as their identity becomes fractured into different personas. It's as if the mind itself is trying to escape the cage of suffering. The Stanford prison experiment, though it was conducted in a controlled environment, showed just how quickly the human mind can descend into madness when subjected to power and abuse. Volunteers, in a matter of days, began to act out aggressive behaviors, both as guards and prisoners. The human mind, it seems, can endure only so much. Once that threshold is crossed, reality itself becomes something far less stable. What if there were no end to it, no relief, no escape? Would the mind crack under the weight of it all, or would it simply become something else entirely? Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence is not just an abstract thought, it is the ultimate test of human resilience. If suffering were to continue forever, would we find meaning in it? Or would it drive us to the edge of insanity? Perhaps, as Jean-Paul Sartre wrote in Being and Nothingness, it is in the recognition of suffering as absurd that we find our breaking point. The human mind is not built to understand endless pain, to find meaning in something so grotesque. Without meaning, what is left? Madness. And this is what mindfulness is prevented by, the kind of breaking point the human mind cannot accept. We each have limits, but when those limits are surpassed, when pain becomes infinite, what happens? Can the mind survive, or does it collapse into the abyss of its own madness? In the end, the only answer may lie in the silence that follows when the mind can no longer scream.